I am delighted to introduce Jenna Redmond from Gender Spectrum, who is going to be presenting on Navigating the Holidays, a guide for parents, caregivers or parents and caregivers of transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive youth. And I love the term gender expansive. It just, it thrills me. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to do the housekeeping. Ways to engage. Anybody who's been here before understands that the primary way to engage is the chat. And we love to get your comments. You can use it with each other. You can use it to ask questions. You can use it to answer questions. So hi, Jennifer from Michigan. Great to see you here today. So the chat is the primary way. And if you want to say something or ask a question, you can be heard as well by raising your hand. That's a little bit of a process, which is just that Andrew will need to unmute you. You'll need to unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to speak. And it doesn't work functionally to share your screen. We want it to, but for some reason we can't get it to acknowledge you as a panelist yet. So maybe next year. Let's go to the next slide. Whenever Be Strong Families does any gathering, we want the space to be safe, and we co-create this safe space together. So we find that by agreeing to speak from our own experience, to treat other people the way we want to be treated, and to be here now works. And if you need a minute, take a minute. That just means, we understand that you have a life. We understand that there's stuff going on. So if you need to step away for any reason, step away and come back. And if you agree to these agreements, do like Emily just did and Andrew did, and just put I agree in the chat. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, Cherie. All right. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Jenna, and I'm going to go off camera until I'm needed again at the end. And welcome, Jenna. And I'm looking forward to this presentation, as I'm sure we all are. Thank you. Hi, Donna.
Thank you, Katthe. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to spend this next hour with you all. We're going to be talking a little bit about navigating the holidays and some of the specific things that can come up for transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive youth, and a little bit of an overview around how we think about and sort of talk about gender at Gender Spectrum. And feel free to, I'll try to kind of follow the chat throughout. So if you have questions or want things clarified, feel free to put it in there, and I'll try to kind of monitor it as we go. I'm excited to be with you all today. We can go to the next slide, Andrew. Okay, so I wanted to share just a little bit about who is Gender Spectrum. So we are a national nonprofit. Many of us are based in the Bay Area, so I'm in Oakland, California. And our work is all around creating a gender-sensitive and inclusive environment for all children and teens. So we primarily do that through kind of like, I always look at it as a visual, like putting the child at the center. And then we think about like, who are all the different people that interact with a child on like a day-to-day basis. So whether that's parents or caregivers, teachers, faith leaders, coaches, extended family, neighbors. And often we're thinking about how can we support those people in creating a more inclusive understanding of gender to better support that child and feeling like they can be their authentic self in their gender. And a lot of our kind of approach is really meeting people where they're at in conversations around gender. I think often there's a lot of fear maybe and worry in not knowing everything about gender, saying the wrong thing, feeling like you can't ask the questions that you have because maybe they're not like the right questions. And we really come from this approach of like really wanting to meet people where they're at, and anyone who shows up into spaces like this space today, we're like super appreciative that people are here and wanting to learn. And so we want conversations about gender to feel digestible, comfortable, safe, and to really like bring as many people into the conversation as we can. Yeah, and so we work, some of the areas that we work in are we do professional developments. We do a lot of work with school trainings and school providers. We have a lot of parent programming. So we do like national support groups. We have a lot of online groups for parents. We do educational programs, and then we do some youth programming. And then we also run a couple conferences every year. The last 2 years, they've been virtual. Previously, they were in person. So we do a conference for youth and their families that are exploring gender. And then we do a professional development conference too for anyone that's kind of wanting to learn a little bit more about gender. So that's just a little bit about who we are. We have staff, some in the Bay Area and then across the country as well. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so before we dive into some of the specific kind of tips and tricks for the holidays, I wanted to give just a little overview of some of the things that we think about when we talk about gender. And so one of the first things that we often share with folks is really thinking about how gender is all around us from a really, really young age. And so this example shows a picture of a rattle for a sweet baby girl and another one for a busy baby boy. And in this image, we can really see the like how young some of these ideas about gender are given to us, right? So this is for like a 3 to 18-month-old. And so even just from the like, I have a 3-year-old, I'm a foster parent. And one of the things that I always say to people is like, if you want to see how kind of intense these ideas around gender are, you can just go to any sort of like baby section of a store and you can really see the like difference in what's catered towards girls and what's catered towards boys at such a young age. So this is just one example we like to show of what that can kind of look like from a young age. And we can go to the next one, Andrew. And also just that these expectations for gender can also start even before a child is like fully in this world, right? So we know that the gender reveal kind of parties are often really popular. So this is an example of a gender reveal cake. And it says like touchdowns for boys and tutus for girls. And I think the reason that we like to show this is I think often we can see these things as very like harmless, right? And that they're kind of like, oh, these are just like fun traditions that people have. But I think it really highlights how embedded are like ideas of what a girl is and what a boy is before a child is even born, right? And so this idea we often, or like a narrative we have in our head around what a boy is going to be interested in and what a girl is going to be interested in are often like these narratives are created before we even really fully know the child. And so we like to just kind of highlight some of that when we're really thinking about how much the things around gender are often things we have to like unlearn or retrain because we've been given like such specific messaging from a really young age. Let me go to the next one. And so a little bit just about me. My name's Jenna Redmond. I use they and she pronouns. Some people will ask me like, what does that mean that you use both pronouns? And so for me, my preference is if when people are talking about me, they kind of like alternate at different times between both pronouns. So an example might be like, oh, I went to this webinar on supporting gender expansive youth. The presenter Jenna was there. They were super funny and really great. And she shared a lot of examples around gender. And I'll be reaching out to them for future resources. So for me, I kind of like when the pronouns are alternated like that, not in like every sentence, but just using both of them at different times. I'm the director of education at Gender Spectrum. So I do a lot of different webinars on kind of overviews of gender, supporting non-binary young people. We do a lot of educational things around gender for young people to better understand gender for themselves. That's kind of the focus of my work. I identify as non-binary and queer. So for me, that means that I just never really felt like the ideas around what it meant to kind of be a boy and a girl fit for me. I always felt kind of different, like it couldn't fit into these rigid categories. I was raised Catholic, so I went to Catholic grade school and high school. And I think That process definitely influenced kind of, I didn't have a lot of access, I think, to thinking about gender in more expansive ways. So it really took me like until college to kind of start realizing that there were other ways that I could sort of express my gender and think about my gender than what had kind of been taught to me for a long time. And like I mentioned earlier, so I'm a foster parent in Oakland, and I currently have a awesome 3-year-old that my wife and I are spending a lot of time with. So those are just some of the different frameworks that I bring and experience that I bring to this work. We can go to the next one. Thank you. And then lastly, when we're kind of thinking about how gender is all around us, one thing that we really like to highlight is how important it is that we all think about how we're impacted by rigid ideas of gender. So regardless of how we identify, even if we're not transgender or non-binary or gender expansive, that, before we kind of think about like supporting gender expansive youth, that we recognize that this fight and this conversation is really about everyone. There are so many ways that we are impacted by ideas around gender, regardless of what our gender identity is. And so we really like to kind of name that at the beginning of conversations around gender. So some of the questions I often pose to groups when we're talking about gender is, questions like, how have gender norms around what it means to be a man impacted you in your life? We have this image on the right that says men and boys are allowed to cry. That's a common one that we hear from a lot of boys and men, is like, I wasn't able to show my emotions, right? I couldn't express myself. That wasn't something that was seen as being like okay or strong. And then often we pose the question too of how have expectations about what it means to be feminine impacted you? And I've heard some really very interesting examples. One I recently heard that I thought was really interesting in one of our groups was a woman talked about how whenever she's driving, if she's the driver in the car with her husband, people assume that her husband is sick or doesn't feel well. And she was saying like, no, I'm just the one driving. But there are just so many things like that throughout kind of day to day that are impacted around gender. So I really encourage folks to, regardless of what your own gender identity is, that it can be really powerful to spend some time kind of thinking about how you've been impacted yourself by gender, because that often can help us have more transformative conversations about how to really create safe spaces for gender expansive young people. And we can go to the next one. And so one thing I wanted to name, and I feel like some of these slides might be a little bit out of order, so we can kind of bounce back and forth a little bit. But so we know that these rigid ideas around gender can really impact all young people, but we also know that transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive youth are particularly harmed. So things like, there's like a lot of, can be increased drug use, self-harm. There's often a lot of young trans people who have disordered eating. Things related to that can be disproportionately impacting gender expansive youth versus cisgender youth. And we also know that like the harm and stress factors can be compounded by other sort of intersecting systems. So when we're thinking about things like class, race, ethnicity, culture, disability, like languages we speak, all of these things impact the experience that a gender expansive person will have in unique ways. And just some of the examples I'll give specific to class. So when we're thinking about things like access to stable housing, or if it's a gender expansive person who is potentially wanting to go on hormones or seek some sort of surgery, having competent healthcare can really impact their experience. What kind of schools they have access to, right? If there's schools that are going to be affirming of their gender, or if there's schools that aren't, like all of those things really impact the experience of young people when we're thinking about their gender as well. And we can go to the next one. So that was kind of what we were talking about. Of while all children are limited by these narrow gender roles and stereotypes, we do know that transgender, non-binary youth are impacted in really specific ways. And so some of those are things like disordered eating, drug and alcohol abuse, non-suicidal self-injury, anxiety and depression. And we do know that there are much higher rates of suicide as well. And we can go to the next one. Let's see. So there are some studies around the impact of support. So youth who perceive that their parents and families strongly supported them in regards to their gender were 93% less likely to attempt suicide. And that's a statistic we share a lot because, like, to me, that's the core of the work that we're doing, is when we see the impact that support can have on young people that's this drastic, we know that like there's something there, right? And that it's important to be like creating spaces where everyone is learning about gender so that we can get to this place where more parents and caregivers are showing up for young people so that we can decrease some of these mental health statistics more.
Jenna, can I ask you a question? Just clarification of terms. Are trans and gender expansive synonyms?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we kind of use gender expansive as this like umbrella term. It's sort of like, because there are so many terms around gender, there's no way that we could name all of them like every time we're talking about them. So we use gender expansive as kind of this umbrella of any young person who might fit outside of traditional gender norms. So there might be some trans people who would be like, yeah, gender expansive fits for me. There might be some people who are like, I wouldn't use that term. I would be more specific. I would use like non-binary or trans or gender queer, but kind of for the sake of like time sometimes too, we sort of use gender expansive as like a catch-all. Yeah.
What happened to PowerPoint, Andrew?
Just to interject real quick, it looks like when there was some issues with porting over the slides, I guess they got randomized. So I'm just going to go with the original slides that Jenna sent over. So I'll stop the screen share when we get to the closing slides. My apologies about that.
Oh, that's okay. That's really fine. But yeah, that's a good question. And we're not really going to go into all the terms today, but that is we do a webinar every couple of months of just a larger understanding of gender. And we do go over some of the terms because I think
the holidays, right? Today we're trying to get
yeah, but I know the terms can be confusing for people a little bit too. But yeah, that's a great question. And so so going back to the slides, there was a recent study by the Trevor Project that surveyed 35,000 youth ages 13 to 24. And in that study, they found that 42% of LGBTQ youth had seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. So I think like that to me is so alarming, right? And to know that that's such current information, but it's part of why we kind of then share that flip side of things, that shows that like the parental support and the caregiver support can decrease this by 93%. And so I like to share that to be like, there is hope and there are little things that we can be doing that make a really big impact on these young people. So yeah, and youth that perceived that there was a level of support were 93% less likely. And so I think those are important to kind of pair together. And so some of the examples, like using a trans child's chosen name, so whatever name they share, they feel comfortable with, at home with friends and at school, has shown to reduce depression symptoms by 71%. So these little things like using the name a child's comfortable with, using the pronouns they're comfortable with, those things can really impact some of these more concerning like mental health numbers that we often see. Okay, so thank you everyone for listening to my kind of very fast overview. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about specifics around navigating the holidays. And yeah, feel free to put in the chat or pause me if there's questions that you have during this. Okay, so a couple reminders. One thing as we go through some of these slides, that the age of the child makes a really big difference. We have, the families that we work with might be the range of like a toddler to like a 19-year-old. And so just keeping that in mind, right? Some of these strategies and tips for a 3 or 4-year-old is going to look really different from a preteen and from a teen. And also that the holidays are different for everyone. So while this is kind of like holiday themed, I just want to recognize too, like everyone has different traditions and faith backgrounds and different cultures that impact. Some people might be celebrating the holidays right now, some people may not, and that might impact your experience as well. Another thing is that we've really seen COVID have an impact on the experience of young people figuring out their gender. And so we have some families where there may be their kids started exploring their gender at the beginning of the pandemic, and now they're going to see friends and families for the holidays that they haven't seen in 2 years. And so there's this like really increased pressure around seeing family because of like this gap in time of sort of visiting with people, and their kid might be going by a different name now, or looking different, or expressing themselves in different ways. And then we have families where that's really not the case at all, right? So just holding that there are these kind of like a variety of experiences during this weird time that we're in. And then the last thing I like to share too is just that not all holiday time is doom and gloom. I think for these slides, we picked things that we know can often be stressors for families and for young people, but just to keep in mind that not all of this may resonate with every family, right? You might pick and choose things that feel relevant to you. We go to the next one. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about why the holidays can be a challenging time, and why we hear from like so many people that this time of year can be stressful for gender expansive young people. So one piece that I just kind of mentioned is there's often this element of interacting with people you may not see regularly. So whether that's like extended family, friends, maybe you're in like your faith community that's more extended than it typically is. And that can bring up some, I think, anxiety and just like this fear of unknown for both caregivers, parents, and the youth. And holidays in general can, I think, bring up a lot of stress, right? It can often bring up complicated family dynamics, regardless of bringing in gender, right? The holidays can be just a stressful time. And I think particularly for parents and caregivers, we often hear that there's kind of like this conflict and tension between how do I support the needs of my child around like the acceptance and sort of tolerance that they need. And there might be relationships that you really want to hold on to that are important to you. And sometimes those things are in conflict, right? Sometimes there's like a family member that a parent's really close to, and that family member is not at the place where they can really show up in an inclusive way for the child. And so that can just be very stressful for parents to navigate. Another thing is that the holiday gatherings often include like alcohol or activities that just like increase possibility for conflict or unpredictableness. And so I think that's often an element in the room that doesn't always get named. Sometimes there's this thing I feel like around the holidays where it's like, okay, we're just going to like bring up topics that can be stressful. Maybe that's like political conversations, whatever it may be. And so I think that's always in the room. And then the last thing is that the holidays can often be a really gendered time. And what we often hear from families is that until they had a like transgender, non-binary young person in their life, they didn't realize like all these things around the holidays. So things like the clothing expectations, gift giving, what kind of gifts we give, decorations, even the activities that we're doing. Sometimes faith spaces can be somewhat gendered, and just general conversation. So kind of combining all of this is often why the holidays can be a challenging time. Next slide. And so there's kind of two key takeaways that we like to share with families around the holidays. One is how important it is to have a plan ahead of time that's really thought through with both the caregiver or caregivers and child. So what I often tell young people is like, sometimes when we're working on creating like a self-care plan or some sort of support plan, like we need that plan in place before we're in the situation that we know is going to be stressful. So it's not like, well, once we go into a space where we're maybe around people that we're not often around, that's not the time to be like, okay, I'm going to like make my support plan now. We want to have the plan ahead of time. So creating that plan ahead of time is really important, and checking in with your child about what their expectations around the holidays are, what their boundaries are, and if possible, doing that before like holiday time, during, and after. So those are kind of the two important pieces as we go through some of these practical tips. And so the bulk of, I think, where the work really is around holidays is like the pre-planning. So as different situations unfold in real time, it's not always easy to know like how or if to help your child. So sometimes we'll hear from parents like, someone at the holiday dinner didn't use the right pronouns. And I didn't know in the moment, should I interrupt and say something? Should I not? I didn't know what my child needed in that moment. So sometimes it's hard to know in the moment what's needed. Things like, do they want me to step in and say something? Would they prefer that I not say something? And another thing that we often talk about with parents is really assessing as a parent what your boundaries and expectations are with extended family and community, and how they interact with your child. Because ultimately, as parents, like, we have so much power in how we conduct ourselves and other people in the spaces that like our kids are in. And so that's a question that we pose to parents a lot, is like, what's okay for you in terms of like how family members talk about gender in front of your kid, right? What are your like negotiables? What are things where it's like, okay, this is no longer a safe space for my child, and so I might not be able to continue being in this space. And just having a plan, having those conversations ahead of time can really help alleviate some of the stress and complexity and feelings, I think, that can come up in the moment. Okay, so these are just some practical kind of questions to ask your child and think about together. And one thing I also just want to name as we go through these is that for a lot of young people, they don't have like the access and safety to be at a place with their families where they're able to have these conversations. So when we created these kind of tips, it was really for kind of parents and caregivers who are at the place where they feel like they're kind of actively showing up for their kid. They want information around gender. To some degree, they can have these conversations with their kids. And so I just want to name that this is possible with some families. And for a lot of youth, like a lot of the youth we work with, if we're not working with their families, they're like, this is kind of a dream for them, right? To be at this place. So I just want to name that too, that these strategies and tips are not accessible for everyone. And sometimes for a young person, it might be like, yeah, that would be great. And that might be possible in a few years, but right now we're just not at that place. But some of the things that we encourage parents to think about with their kid, one is name and pronouns. So talking ahead of time about what name and pronouns does the child want you to use? Is it different depending upon like what people are around? Another important question can be like, do you want me to correct people if they use the wrong pronouns? Some kids might be like, yes, that's really important to me. Other kids might be like, it's way too much spotlight and I don't want to then like have another conversation about it. So that can be really important. Planning ahead around things like clothing, shoes, hairstyle, accessories. That can be really important. I think planning ahead for what events are happening, how that may impact your child and their gender expression. So kind of how they're showing their gender to other people. The holidays can often be a time that there's increased gender dysphoria for many youth. So this feeling of kind of like their genders doesn't feel aligned. They don't feel maybe good about their body. They may not feel great about like their gender expression. If people are not using the right pronouns or name for them, right? All of these things can impact this increased feeling of discomfort really in their gender. And that's often why we see like maybe an increase in anxiety or depression for gender expansive young people during the holidays. So the more you can help with that around planning ahead, right? Like if there's a dinner you all are going to, thinking ahead of like talking through maybe what outfit your child's going to wear, how do they feel in that, supporting them in wearing what feels most affirming, and what their expectations are around, like, how might you feel if someone comments on the outfit you're wearing, or are you expecting people to comment on it? All of those conversations ahead of time, I think, can be really helpful. Another thing that we've shared with parents is around decoration. So obviously it depends on what holidays you're celebrating, but thinking ahead about creating new decorations that might reflect the more like how your child is currently expressing their gender. So if a young person has maybe changed the name that they're using, often there's like old stockings that have the old name on it, or ornaments, or there might be pictures on things that the child might not be comfortable with. And because like so many spaces maybe outside of the home might not be affirming for your child, creating these like decorations in the holiday space that is affirming in your home can really impact like the young person feeling seen and feeling safe. And so that can really go a long way. And, maybe just changing the stocking, or updating the decorations that you have, whatever you do that just makes it a little bit more current. And then kind of with that, gift giving can also be a really great opportunity for gender affirming memories for a young person. The flip side is that it can also be really upsetting if they get gifts that they don't feel reflect kind of their gender identity. So getting a sense ahead of time of like what kind of gifts they're interested in, what things would make them feel comfortable, what wouldn't, so that you can also communicate that to other people. I was just recently facilitating one of our teen groups, and a transgender teen in that group was talking about how she's not out to any of her family, and seeing her sibling get all of these like really feminine gifts that she really wants can just be like a really upsetting experience. And so just thinking about the flip side of like, how would it feel for that kid to actually get gifts that feel like they reflect the gender that she is, and that, that can go a long way. So that's something to encourage parents to think about. We can go to the next one. Thank you. And then just a few more questions to ask your child, think about together. So one is really identifying what questions are not okay to ask. Often when people hear about gender, they have lots of questions, right? And then they're not often in a space like this where it's like a webinar style where it's like, bring your questions, we want to answer them. When there's young people involved, we want to be careful about what questions we're asking in front of them. So for parents, we encourage them to talk to their kid about like, thinking about, are there questions or topics about gender that your child does not want to engage in or be asked about? And together you can come up with kind of your clear boundaries, as well as how they would like support if those boundaries are crossed. So some examples might be, I don't want family members to ask about my new name. I don't want them to comment about it. I don't want to hear anything about it. If someone does say something about it, I would like for you to step in. That might be an example. Another one, often young people will share, like, I don't want people asking about my body. Often when people meet someone who's gender expansive, they might quickly go to questions about like, are you on hormones? Are you going to have surgery? And sometimes those things might feel really personal to a young person, and they might not even know yet where they're fully at in their gender. So kind of thinking about what's completely off limit to ask, as well as the flip side of what are questions that are okay to ask, right? Sometimes there are young people who like really want to talk about their gender. That feels good to them. So just getting on the same page about what those things are, I think can save a lot of stress and potential like damage during different events. Okay, and this is just a little bit of a disclaimer. So that's like a lot of, all the tips and tricks that we just shared are a lot of different things, right? And those can feel like overwhelming topics, probably both for parents and for young people themselves. So one thing we like to encourage folks to remember is just not all communication needs to be both an in-person conversation or happen all at once, right? It might not be the best approach to be like, we have a whole list here of things we need to go through before the family event. What name do you want? What do you want to wear? Like going through all that might feel very overwhelming. And and they can feel like vulnerable topics for a young person to maybe express honestly. So just thinking about like, can you incorporate that into different conversations, thinking about the specific child and their needs. If they're a teen, they might be more interested in just like texting you the answers to their questions, right? It might be like pulling teeth a little bit to get the information. If it's a younger kid, it might be through like play that you're asking these things, through different like activities. Maybe you're doing like a play activity or drawing together. So just keeping that in mind, right? Doing what feels most like the best approach for the specific kid that you are, working with or parenting. And yeah, taking your time a little bit with some of this because it can be sometimes overwhelming for them. Okay, and then the other piece with this is really thinking about, once you've sort of figured out what your child feels comfortable with, is then thinking about how are you going to communicate that to other people? Because it's one thing if you all have the conversation, but there might be practical things that other people in the space need to know about before you all just show up together. And different individuals probably have different relationships with you and your child. So it's likely that there might be some people that your child is like, I want them to know this information. And there might be others with whom they don't want to share certain things or anything at all. So there are some questions and things to consider when you're sort of deciding who to communicate with. And so just always having that conversation with your child about what is their preference for communication. Who will tell them some of these things? How will it be communicated? We have a resource on our website that kind of just breaks down like communicating with friends and family. And then also thinking about, sometimes for holiday gatherings, there's guests attending who maybe you don't know, maybe they've never met your child. They might be like a relative or a friend of someone else that's there. So just being clear, like with the host or whoever's invited them, about what you feel comfortable sharing. Because that sometimes I think that's a dynamic we're in during the holidays that we're not in other spaces of like, you might be in a space where you're like, I actually have never met this person. I don't know what their views are on gender. My child doesn't have a relationship with them. So I might not be sharing like the most personal pieces of their gender journey. And so just thinking about that ahead of time could be helpful. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing the links in the chat too. So we talked a lot about kind of pre-planning for the holidays. I feel like that's the bulk of the work, is like having this plan going into the holiday time. But then during the holiday time and after, there are also other things that you can think about that might make the experience a little bit easier. So one is just really checking in with your child, even if things seem to be going well. Planning to check in as the gathering is happening. Sometimes we've heard from families having like a code word can be helpful. Just any way to both like create space for them to step away from others if they need a break, but also just to show that like you see them, you know that the dynamic might be challenging and you're just kind of like, wanting to check in, see how they're doing. And so then with that, we encourage folks to take breaks, suggesting ways for you and your child to step away. This could be, simple things like going outside, sitting in the car, taking a walk. Sometimes it might be more serious of like needing to leave an event early. We encourage people to think about, and hopefully this doesn't happen, but considering like, what, if anything, would cause you to leave a gathering? Sometimes we hear from families that they're like, it just wasn't a healthy space for my kid to be in. I didn't feel comfortable as a parent having them there when I could tell they were uncomfortable. And so just setting kind of your own expectations and boundaries as a parent too, of what would need to happen for you to feel like it's not a safe space to be in. And then seeking support. So just keeping in mind that there are different ways for you or your child to get support as things unfold. For young people, we encourage them to like keep in touch with their friends, texting, joining an online group, just to have that space to check in. And the same thing for parents and caregivers, right? Having spaces to kind of vent and process can be really important too. Okay, and then the last piece is after holiday time. So we really encourage people to check in with your child following the event. It doesn't need to be right away. It doesn't need to be checking in about everything, but trying not to let it go too long without kind of talking about how things went. And it can be helpful for those conversations to be both like the positive moments that you had, the difficult moments. Sometimes providing your child with like a sense of perspective can be helpful. If like sometimes we'll hear like if one or two people use the wrong pronouns for a young person, that might be like all they remember from the holiday time, right? So also you can validate that while also reminding them that like maybe there were other moments that they were enjoying like time with their family or whatever they were doing. And then following up with individuals if needed. Sometimes there are follow-up conversations that the wrong conversations of like, hey, it's really important that you use the correct name. Here's why. And, we might not be able to see you as often if you aren't able to do that. So whatever those conversations may be. And then the last thing, which I think is really, really important, is the self-care piece for parents and caregivers. So as much as the holiday time can be stressful for the youth themselves, like even when I go through these slides, I'm like, this is a lot of things for parents and caregivers to consider and to think about on top of just like all the other stresses of the holiday time. So just if you're a parent or a caregiver, making sure that you find community. We have a lot of online groups for parents, having someone that you can talk to about the things that are going on, or someone you can celebrate like the successes with. Just finding ways to like unplug if you can and have some sort of self-care is really important. And so with that, just the last few things, I wanted to share some of the resources that we have at Gender Spectrum. So we have a variety of online family support groups. We run them on Zoom, and it's a great way to connect with other families across the country. You can just listen in if you feel more comfortable just listening. There's also lots of time to share if you want to share. In the parent groups, we often also break the parents up into age of kids, so you can connect with other parents who are really can kind of understand where your kid's at. We have groups for youth, and then we also have groups for professionals as well. So we also run a facilitator support group. So if you're someone running groups for gender expansive youth or their families, we have support for that too. And thank you, Andrew, for putting that in the chat. And then we also have a lot of resources on our website. So we didn't go into, a lot of details outside of the holidays, but often people have questions about like working with their child's school, how they communicate all of this to people, in their circle, friends and family, finding affirming providers, legal support, navigating privacy and safety, like all these other things. We have a lot of resources on that. And then you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. We post a lot of different like educational things about gender, and also when we have different programs coming up. So that's a good way to kind of stay connected to us as well. And then there's my email. So if you have any questions,
minutes for questions, right? So maybe there are, people in the chat have questions.
Yeah. If anyone has questions, we have time for that. And we can just leave the slide up for a minute if people want to write down my email too.
Yep.
I know that's like a lot of information.
And it's a lot of information, and it's also information that's transferable to other kinds of issues. It reminds me that this isn't like a completely different approach to parenting. If you're thinking about before the holidays what issues might be difficult for your child, and how to run interference for them, and how to just communicate with them in different ways to ask them what they're comfortable with, and what they're afraid about, what they're nervous about. It seems just really, really applicable.
Yeah, and that's kind of something we like share with parents. And then I did this similar presentation, but kind of with youth, of like, how do we support you in figuring out what are your expectations for the holidays? How do you communicate that? And our big theme around that was like, this doesn't have to be specific to the holidays, right? This can be a lot of different dynamics and spaces that we're in. It might be that the holidays are not the stressful time for you, right? But there's like another situation or space you're in. And so taking that structure, but utilizing it in a different way, for sure.
So what do you do if your child, you have one of these, if you have a child that says, I don't want to think about it, or I don't want to talk about it, or I just don't want to go, you know?
Yeah. I think that I think for the kids that don't want to talk about it, one thing is in some ways talking with them about managing their expectations of like, if you don't want to talk about it, other people might, right? And this is an opportunity to have some control over like what people might say and what might happen. And if we don't talk about it, then like these are the potential things that might come up, like just preparing them a little bit.
Yeah,
um,
I'm saying I don't want to talk about it with you. Like if you're trying
oh
as a parent to do, to follow the advice, to plan in advance, to know what the expectations are, and to, I'm just imagining, in situations I've encountered as a parent where I want to think it through, but my child doesn't want to think it through. That
yeah.
just makes them more anxious to think. They didn't think about all the things that might go wrong before I started raising it, and
Yeah. I think one thing is sometimes that's just the reality, right? So sometimes it's sitting with the like, as parents, we're always thinking ahead, and our kids often are not. So sometimes it's just we have to just sit with that and know, like, okay, well, we tried. They didn't want to talk about it. And that's just things will come from that. And maybe that's the growing area for the child, right? Afterwards is learning, like, oh, if I had made a plan around this, maybe this thing wouldn't have happened. I think the other piece too around that, especially with gender, is trying to think of where they do feel comfortable talking about it. Sometimes it isn't with a parent. Sometimes it's like a cousin or a relative that's maybe younger that they feel like better understands what they're going through. Maybe it's like the online groups we do where you're kind of anonymous. And so there isn't this like personal vulnerability in the same way. So exploring to like different, maybe it's like, yeah, I get it. You don't want to talk to me about that. Like, are there some other people that we could plug in,
awesome.
for
Yeah,
support?
Andrew says Brenda has her hand raised. So Brenda, we'd love to unmute you and have you be able to speak.
Hey, so I have a question, and I'll try to condense this as much as I can.
Yeah.
I have a 30-year-old who was born male, and just within the last 3 years, she's had the surgery and everything. She's trans. And so there are a couple of things that are going on with her. She is autistic. She has a problem with feeling empathy. She really, really super struggles with that. And so she just doesn't have a lot of feeling, and she hates it. She feels guilty about it. She's learned to make accommodations for that. So when she hears something or sees something, she'll do the speech. Oh my gosh, I feel so, but she's not feeling it. And so and the reason I tell you that is because I think this is part of that. So she recently moved home from Seattle to Illinois. And my daughter and son-in-law, my son-in-law had at first just had a terrible problem with her. I mean, couldn't accept it, was not, just blah. And so I've talked to him a lot about her. And finally, he decided to make this break and personally invited her for Christmas dinner, which was, to me, was just so huge. And so when she got this invitation, she wasn't going, she didn't really want to go. She would just rather stay at home by herself. And so I said, I talked her into going. I need to know if that was wrong.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there are so many layers there, right?
I know.
I think it speaks to like so much of whenever we're navigating anything, right? It's not just one thing. There's usually all these intersecting components. If there was just one thing, it would be so much easier for us to live our lives, right? Like, I don't think you're wrong for for trying to convince her to go, I think is this for this year? For this
Yes.
Christmas?
Yes.
I think what sounds like maybe what's important is just talking to your son-in-law about like making sure that it's going to be a safe space for her.
It is for sure.
Mm,
Because since he put that invitation out there, he's gone. She bought a house, and so there were some things that needed to be fixed, and he's gone and he's fixed those things for her. He has helped her with different things, and so he's all in.
mm-hmm.
You
Then
know?
I think it's good. I think maybe you could have some options around like letting her know it's okay to leave if
Right. Okay.
And
Okay.
how
she
to
wants
leave,
to leave at some is like,
and
I'm
maybe,
sorry.
and maybe how to leave. Do you know what I mean? Like
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
practicing how to leave, in advance, so that,
Right.
because sometimes it gets overwhelming, or it's not a safe space anymore, as you're saying, Jenna.
mhm.
But the way to like politely defer, and
Yeah.
instead of blowing it up,
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, because I think that can alleviate some of just the internal pressure too of like, okay, I'm going, this might feel kind of scary. It's something new, but I have a plan in place if it becomes too much at some point.
Yes. Yes.
And
I like too that you said have kind of this signal between us that maybe I can bail her out without making a big deal of it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something we would definitely put into place.
Yeah. But I think it's like, it's great when you have the opportunity to like kind of rebuild these relationships or have spaces
Yes.
where it can be affirming and safe. And so treading lightly, but like sometimes we do have to do a little push,
Yes.
but I think as long as there are ways to leave or like take breaks or things like that, then I think that will help everyone.
Right. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Let us know how it goes.
Okay. I will.
Thank you for sharing. Also, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
That's such a great example of just all the layers too.
Yes.
And like regardless of age, right? It's like a lot of these things still, it doesn't really matter. The age matters a little bit, but like a lot of the dynamics are just there in different ways.
We have time for another question. Anybody in the chat have a question they want to pose in the chat? Jennifer says awareness, understanding, and gentle guidance is everything. Building an understanding and plan in anticipation of gatherings. Thank you for this. Your work is remarkable and your delivery perfect and understandable. You are so appreciated.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice. Yeah, thank you. This has been a great audience. It's hard sometimes with the webinar because you can't see everyone, everyone's there.
Okay, Andrew, you want to put our closing slides up and we can round it out? What do we want to amplify? This is a nice, we always kind of close with this kind of a question to the group, just to have you have the opportunity to think through like one word that comes out or a hashtag that comes out of this webinar for you. Is it compassion, amplify compassion, amplified preparation? What is the one word? What would you like to amplify coming out of this this presentation? And everybody in the chat is welcome to, everybody participating. What are you taking away that you want to amplify? I mean, I think one of the things I would say is intentional parenting, amplify acceptance, Brenda says. Amplify understanding, Andrew says. Who else? Compassion over comprehension. Thank you, Jenna. Yes. Compassion over comprehension. Yeah, because finally it's just, if people feel accepted and welcomed and included and appreciated, and not like examined and parsed and quizzed. And I mean, that's what we want out of our families and our holidays, right? We want to feel like we can just be who we are and show up as we are, and we're going to be accepted, and welcomed and appreciated, and not, gentle parenting, Nadia says, amplify gentle parenting. Nice. Okay, next slide, Andrew. Webinars, we're closing out the year. There's one more. Next, we have our Taste of Cafes and our Spanish webinar tomorrow. And then next Monday, we're off after next Monday until the new year. But the third act holiday edition, conversations for emerging elders and grandparents. We have a new deck coming out for cafes for emerging elders and grandparents. So I'd love you to be able to be here with us on December 20th. Next slide. Our annual campaign, Show Your Love for Families. This is also ending at the end of the year, but we'd love you to support Be Strong Families work to assist ourselves and also all the people in our network with being able to be more inclusive. So next slide. Questionable, curious conversation, endless fun. It's here. It's a game. And it's perfect for the holidays. It's about keeping the conversation happy and productive and fun and light, and also opportunities for getting to know each other more deeply. But it kind of models what we're talking about in terms of, you get to choose which question you want to answer. So nobody's put on the spot, and you can keep it light if you want, or you can go deeper if you want. These are just some examples of people's families playing. So it's available on our website, and please subscribe to our webinars on YouTube, our YouTube channel. Andrew put the link in the chat. So Jenna, thank you for being here. We look forward to connecting and collaborating going forward. Thank you for the work you do, and happy holidays.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Andrew, for the tech support. It's unseen, but not unnoticed.
I'm very glad to help. I'm really sorry about the little tech issue with the first slides, but I'm really
Oh, no worries. No worries. It's great to be here with you all.
Okay, take care, everybody. See you next time, and have